tongue and groove doors on my shop cabinet have stayed straight and work fine for about a dozen years now. Tongue and groove really is a simple way of making doors like this, and we're going to show you how to do it. The first thing we need to do is figure out how wide our rails and stiles are going to be. This really has no impact on how we build the doors. This is just how you want it to look, and you can make them any width you want to, really. I start out by ripping all my stock to the width that I need for the rails and the stiles. Even though my rails and stiles are going to be different widths, ripping all the stock that I need first just saves time later on. I use a flip stop on my miter gauge to make cutting all my pieces easy and accurate. The first cut just squares up this end, then I flip it over and put it against the flip stop, and I can cut the piece to length. To decide on the width of the rails, take the size door that you want, subtract from that the width of both of the stiles, and then add 1 inch to account for the tongue and grooves. Simplifying the math is just one reason that I always make my tongues a ½ an inch long. That also has proved to be very strong over the years. Next we want to cut the grooves, so I set my table saw blade to ½ an inch above the table. Then I set the rib fence so the blade is as close to centered in the wood as I can get it by eye. Then with each piece we make one full pass over the blade, bring it back, turn it end for end, and put the other face against the fence and make a second cut, and that centers the groove perfectly. I tried the plywood in the groove, and that's kind of tight. We want this to fit a little easier than that. We don't want the plywood very loose in the groove, but we want it to be able to move freely. So I'm going to adjust the fence in towards the blade just a little bit. And then we recut the pieces again, making sure we flip them end for end and make that second pass. We always make small adjustments because we're taking wood off of both sides of the groove. Now that the plywood fits the groove properly, we want to start making the tongues. And to do that, we start out with the blade set below the edge of the groove. We start out just a little lower than the groove so we can sneak up on the tongue thickness and get this fit right. I set a gauge block against the fence and then use that to measure to the left side of the blade. I want to make sure that that's a ½ an inch. Then I can move the gauge block to my end of the fence and clamp it in place. Now I can just butt the wood against the gauge block and know that I'm going to take an exactly 1/2 inch cut. I usually start out by making the shoulder cuts on both sides of the piece. Then after I've cut both shoulders, I go back and nibble away the rest of the material. Lots of people use a stacked dado head for this cut, but I can do the nibbling before I can get my stacked dado head set up. Whichever way you want to do it is just fine. Just make sure that you remove the wood before you pull the miter gauge back. Now I want to see how oversized the tongue is so I can get a better idea of how much to raise the blade. Once you establish the right height for the blade, you can go ahead and cut the rest of the tongues on the other ends of the rails. When I get to where the tongues are just a little too tight in the grooves, I'll use my rasp to sweeten them up just a little bit. This goes pretty quickly and you can get a nice fit this way. Now we can set the pieces in our clamps and tighten them up just enough to close the joints. Take a combination square and set the blade to the depth of the groove and lock it in place. Then we can use the combination square to make light marks on the outside of the frames that indicate the bottom. And we want to make marks so we can measure the width and the length so we can get the final size of our center panel. I measure between those marks and subtract about 1/8 of an inch so I have a little bit of extra room for the panel. Then we can use those dimensions to set the rib fence to trim the panel to the right size. I always measure and cut my panels this way, and I've never had one that didn't fit. Then as a final check, we slip the panel into place and put the end on and make sure we can close the joints. This is the final test fit, so if you have a problem, fix it now. When applying the glue, make sure you only put it where the tongues and grooves come together. We don't want to freeze the panel in there. Just glue up the tongues and grooves. It's easy to use too much glue, so just take your time. If you leave too much glue in there, you just got to clean up more when you press this together, like I just did here. With all the glue applied, you can slip the panel into place and put the end on and put it in the clamps. This is where the test fitting earlier pays off, because we don't want to be waiting around while the glue's setting up. I scared myself here because I thought my panel didn't fit, but I just had one of the rails at a little bit of an angle. Then put the assembly in the clamps. Make sure that everything's lined up right, the clamps are in the right places. Then apply just enough pressure to close the joints. We don't want to squeeze it any harder. Seeing how much pressure you can generate with the clamps is a good way to bow a door. Get in the habit of checking assemblies like this to make sure they're square before you allow the glue to dry. Later, you just sand all the faces nice and smooth and you're ready to apply whatever finish you want. I've been building tongue and groove doors, including some big ones, with the same procedure for decades, and I've never had one fail. This is an easy procedure to learn, but you can use it a lot.